2:15 p.m., July 14, 1982. A mother screamed his name into the trees. Bobby Miller, age 7, yellow jacket, 15 yards from the tent, gone in under 5 minutes. For 44 years, the official file said a grizzly took him. That file was wrong. The truth was buried under a fallen redwood by the ranger paid to find him. In 2026, a dying man in a Fresno hospital room finally said it out loud. Here's the confession that broke the case. The 5-minute disappearance to Alumni Meadows sits at 8,700 feet. Thin air, granite domes on every side. The Millers arrived on July 12th, a 2-day drive from Bakersfield. Ray Miller had promised his son one thing all spring: real mountains, not the foothills behind their house. By the 14th, Bobby knew the campsite by heart. Site 34, row C, second from the pit toilets. He'd already named the boulder behind their tent. He called it the Whale Rock, because from the west side it curved like a breaching back. At 2:10 p.m., Ray was kneeling over a fire ring, splitting kindling with the side of a hatchet. His wife, Carol, was inside the tent, sorting the cooler. Bobby asked if he could get pine cones for the fire. Ray didn't look up. "Stay where I can hear you." "I will." Those were the last words either parent heard him say. Carol would tell investigators, 3 separate times over 3 separate years, that she remembered a sound just after. Not a scream, not footsteps, just a soft scrape, like bark shifting under weight. She always qualified it the same way. "It might have been nothing. I've turned that 5 seconds over 10,000 times, and I still don't know." At 2:15, Ray called for him. No answer. He walked to the Whale Rock. No pine cones scattered, no small shoe prints in the dust beside it, a detail that would trouble investigators for decades, because a 7-year-old gathering pine cones should have left a trail, and he hadn't. By 2:25, Ray was running through the campground shouting the boy's name to strangers. By 2:40, a ranger radioed it in as a code Adam. By 3, year 0, the meadow had a search perimeter, the first witness. The camper in Site 36. 2 sites down, a retired schoolteacher named Diane Corsetti was reading in a folding chair. She gave a statement to Fletcher's team that afternoon, and it's preserved verbatim in the original 1982 case file. "I saw the boy, maybe 5 minutes before the mother started calling. He wasn't playing. He was standing very still by the big rock, looking at something on the ground. I thought he'd found an animal. I went back to my book. I've regretted that for 40 years. No one followed up on looking at something on the ground until 2026, the other child. There was a 4th witness that afternoon, though no one thought to call him that at the time because he was 6 years old. Danny Ostrowski was camping 2 sites over with his own family. He and Bobby had spent the previous evening trading rocks they'd collected. Bobby had a piece of obsidian he was especially proud of, black and glassy, that he claimed he'd found himself, though his father later admitted he'd bought it at the gift shop and let the boy believe otherwise. Danny told his mother that first panicked evening, something she wrote down on a napkin because she didn't have paper handy, a detail she kept for 44 years, in a shoebox of the family's old camping photographs. Danny said Bobby told him the night before that he'd heard something moving near the big rock the previous evening. Not scary, Danny said, like somebody was there but being quiet about it. We told the rangers. I don't know if anyone wrote it down. Danny was 6. Nobody puts much weight on what a 6-year-old says he heard 2 nights before a disappearance. The note was never entered into the official file. It surfaced only in 2026, when Danny, 60 by then, a retired high school teacher in Modesto, reached out to Agent Whitlow's office after seeing the arrest on the evening news. I've thought about that rock for 44 years, Danny said, not because I understood what it meant, because I was the last kid he ever talked to, and I never got to tell anyone that mattered. The search begins. By nightfall, the meadow had transformed. Sodium lamps ran on generator cable. A command tent went up beside the ranger station. Volunteers who'd been eating dinner at their own campsites an hour earlier were now walking grid lines with flashlights, calling a name that didn't belong to their own children. Chief Park Ranger Thomas Fletcher took command at 4:45 p.m. 22 years with the Park Service. He'd led 4 previous search and rescue operations in that district, all successful, all resolved within 36 hours. He told his second-in-command, a young ranger named Paul Ackers, something Ackers would repeat to a documentary crew decades later, long after Fletcher's name meant something different. Fletcher looked calm. Too calm. Honestly, for a missing 7-year-old, he said, "We'll have him by morning." I remember thinking, now how does he know that? By July 16th, over 100 people were on the ground. Elite tracking dogs from the FBI's regional field office in Sacramento arrived by helicopter. Their handler, a woman named Rosa Delgado, worked 2 dogs, Scout and Cinder, along the creek bank for 11 straight hours. At 6:20 p.m. on the 16th, both dogs alerted, simultaneously at the base of a granite outcrop half a mile from the campsite, then lost the scent entirely 30 feet later at the edge of the rushing creek. Delgado's field notes, later entered into evidence, read, "Scent terminates at water's edge. No reacquisition after multiple passes. Possible water entry. Handler notes, dogs showed unusual hesitation near outcrop before alert. Atypical behavior, cause undetermined." Fletcher signed off on the theory within 48 hours. The boy had either fallen into an underground current beneath the creek or been taken by a predator, most likely a black bear, possibly a mountain lion, though no scat tracks or kill site were ever recovered to support either. No trace of the yellow jacket was ever logged into evidence. The Millers were told gently and then not so gently as weeks passed that continued searching was unlikely to change the outcome. Carol Miller stayed in that campground for 11 more days after the official search was called off, walking the tree line alone each morning before the ranger station opened, calling her son's name into country that had already stopped listening. The third night. Volunteer coordinators remember the third night of the search, July 16th, differently than the ones before it. The first 2 nights had energy, adrenaline, purpose, the sense that any given flashlight beam might be the one that found him. By the third night, at nearly 10,000 feet of accumulated elevation gain across 3 days of grid walking, exhaustion had set in, and with it, a different kind of silence. Frank De La Rosa was 29 that summer, a mechanic from Merced who'd driven up after seeing a news bulletin, and he kept walking search lines in that district every July for the next 6 years, on his own vacation days, long after the case had gone quiet. "Nobody asked me to keep coming back," he said in 2026. "I just couldn't stop." The third night, I remember my flashlight batteries dying around 2 a.m., and I sat down on a log because I didn't have a spare, and I just listened. You could hear other people's voices calling his name from half a mile off in different directions. It sounded like the whole mountain was saying one word. Carol Miller did not sleep during those 3 nights. She sat outside the command tent, wrapped in a wool blanket someone had given her, refusing every offer to be walked back to a hotel in the valley. Ranger Paul Ackers remembered bringing her coffee near 4 a.m. on the 4th day, just as the light was starting to change over the ridge. She asked me if dogs could smell fear. I told her I didn't know. She said, "I hope he wasn't scared, whatever's happening to him right now." I didn't have anything to say to that. I still don't, honestly, all these years later. This story is a fictional narrative, inspired by real search and rescue procedure and real human loss. Every name, department, and event here is invented for this reconstruction. Now back to the file, 2 people who never stopped. Cases like this don't stay open, they go quiet. But quiet isn't the same as closed, and 2 people in this story refuse to treat it that way. The reporter. Nancy Reyes covered the disappearance for the Fresno Bee in 1982. She was 26 years old, 3 months into the job. She drove up to Yosemite 4 separate times that first year, on her own dime, after her editor told her the story had run its course. "I kept a file," she told an interviewer in 2019, "for a podcast about California cold cases. Not because I thought I'd solve it, because somebody had to remember the actual details, the jacket, the boulder, the creek, after everyone else moved on to the next headline." By 1985, Reyes had interviewed 11 campers who'd been into Alumni Meadows that week. 9 of them said the same thing without prompting. The search wrapped up faster than they expected, given how many resources had been thrown at it. She never published that observation. She had no evidence to back it, and her editor called it grief math. The tendency of witnesses to feel a tragedy should have taken longer to resolve than it did, simply because their own grief hadn't resolved at all. Reyes kept the file in a cardboard box in her garage for the next 41 years. The detective, retired Mariposa County Sheriff's Detective Hal Whitfield, wasn't part of the original case. Yosemite disappearances fall under federal and Park Service jurisdiction, not county, but he'd grown up 2 towns over, and the story stayed with him the way certain cases stay with people who spend their careers around missing persons. In 2011, nearing retirement, Whitfield pulled the old federal file through a records request, mostly out of personal curiosity. He read Fletcher's original closing report 3 times. What bothered him wasn't the conclusion. Bears take children, currents take children. It happens. What bothered him was the paperwork itself. "There's a rhythm to a real search report," Whitfield said later, once he was willing to say anything on the record. "You can tell when an investigator is genuinely stuck, because the report gets messier the longer it goes. More theories, more contradictions, more loose ends. This one was clean. Too clean. It read like someone already knew how it was going to end before they wrote the first page." He flagged the file for a possible cold case review. The request sat in a federal queue for 6 years without action. Nobody's fault. Exactly. The Park Service Inspector General's office was down 2 investigators, and a 40-year-old case with no body and no suspect wasn't going to jump the line. Whitfield retired in 2017. The file stayed open technically, the way thousands of cold cases stay open. Alive on paper, dead in practice. The anniversary, 1992. 10 years to the day, Carol Miller returned to Tuolumne Meadows alone. Ray had stopped coming after year 6, not out of indifference, but because he couldn't drive past the entrance sign without pulling over to be sick on the shoulder of Highway 120. She sat by the Whale Rock for 4 hours. A young ranger, new to the district, found her there near dusk and asked if she needed help back to her car. "I don't need help," she told him. "I need someone to tell me what's under this rock." He didn't know what to say to that. Neither did the report he filed afterward, which simply noted family member present at original disappearance site, no incident, advised of closing hours. Fletcher was still district chief in 1992. He did not go out to meet her. The last years of the file. By 2015, Thomas Fletcher had been retired from the Park Service for 11 years. He lived alone outside Oakhurst. 40 minutes from the park gate he'd worked for over 2 decades. Neighbors described him as private, but not unfriendly, a man who kept his lawn immaculate and rarely spoke about his career. His neighbor of 19 years, Dolores Ibarra, remembered something specific, offered without being asked once the story broke in 2026. Every July, without fail, he'd disappear for 2 or 3 days, never said where. I asked him once, half joking, if he had a secret family somewhere. He didn't laugh. He just said, "Some debts you pay alone." I thought it was strange, but you don't push a man like that. What Fletcher was doing each July has never been independently confirmed. The most credible account, offered by Fletcher himself near the end, and partially corroborated by phone records, is that he drove into the park each year on the anniversary and sat near the fallen redwood for several hours before driving home. By 2020, Fletcher's health had begun to fail, first his knees, then his kidneys. He was diagnosed with stage 4 renal disease in early 2025. His physician, Dr. Amara Osei, noted in his chart that he'd begun asking unusual questions during routine visits, about statute of limitations, about whether confessions given near end of life carried the same legal weight as any other. "I assumed it was generalized anxiety about mortality," Dr. Osei said afterward. "Patients say strange things when they're facing the end. I had no reason at the time to think it meant anything specific." By June 2026, Fletcher was admitted to Fresno Community Hospital in acute renal failure. He was given at most a matter of days. This has been Archive 26. Every detail in this reconstruction, the neighbor, the physician, the anniversary drives, is invented for this fictional case file, built to reflect how real confessions of this kind tend to surface. The events that follow are drawn from the same fictional record. The hospital room. Room 412 faced a parking structure. Fletcher had been there 6 days. His night nurse, a woman named Priya Anand, worked the floor for 11 years and had seen dozens of patients in his condition. The particular restlessness of someone who isn't ready, even when the body is. "He wasn't confused," she said later. "That's the part people get wrong when they hear deathbed confession. They picture someone rambling, half-conscious. He wasn't. He was lucid. He knew exactly what he was doing. He just kept saying he could see yellow, not describing a memory, saying it like it was in the room with him." On the night of July the 9th, 2026, at 2:40 a.m., Fletcher asked Anand for a phone. He said he needed to talk to the FBI, not the police. The FBI specifically. I told him it was the middle of the night. He said, "I know. That's why I'm asking now before I lose the nerve." Anand paged the hospital's on-call social worker, who in turn contacted the FBI's Sacramento field office. It took 90 minutes to route the call to someone with cold case authority. Special Agent Marcus Whitlow, 34 years with the Bureau, took the call at his home at 4:15 a.m. He'd worked exactly one deathbed confession before, a decade earlier, in an unrelated matter. He knew the protocol. Get there fast. Record everything. Don't ask leading questions. Let the dying man talk. He arrived at the hospital just after 6 a.m. Whitlow later described the drive-in from Sacramento, 90 minutes on empty pre-dawn highway, running through every possible scenario the case might turn into. A confession to something small, a confused old man grasping for meaning at the end, or, worst case, and the one he tried not to think about, something that would reopen a wound the Bureau had officially closed decades before he'd even joined. "I've sat with dying men before," Whitlow said. "There's a particular quiet in those rooms. Machines are the only thing still moving at full speed. Everything else has slowed down to match the person in the bed. You walk in and you have to slow down too, or you'll miss what they're actually trying to tell you underneath what they're saying." He signed the recording equipment out of his field office at 5:50 a.m., standard procedure for any statement that might carry evidentiary weight, and called ahead to confirm hospital staff would allow him access outside normal visiting hours. Priya Anand met him at the nurses' station and walked him to room 412 herself. "He looked smaller than I expected," Whitlow said. "You build up an image in your head on the drive over. He was just a very old, very tired man, and for about 90 seconds before he started talking, I actually thought I might have been called out for nothing." The recording. What follows is drawn from the recorded exchange between Fletcher and Agent Whitlow, reconstructed here in dramatized form, consistent with the documented account. "Mr. Fletcher, I'm Agent Whitlow, FBI. You asked to speak with someone from my office. I need you to write something down. I don't have the strength to say it twice. I'm recording, sir. Go ahead whenever you're ready." A long pause, machines beeping. Then, according to the transcript, "There's a boy, Bobby Miller, Yosemite, 1982. Everybody thinks a bear got him. I know the case, sir. It's still listed open." It's not what the file says. Fletcher stopped there for nearly 2 minutes. Whitlow, in a later interview, said he almost prompted him, and then decided not to. "You let a confession breathe," he said. "You don't rush a man to the worst thing he's ever done." When Fletcher continued, his voice had changed, flatter, faster, like a man reading something he'd rehearsed for 44 years without ever saying it aloud. "I got a radio call, private channel, not the department frequency. A man I'd guided on hunting trips before, off the books. Understand, strictly off the books, told me he'd shot something, said it wasn't a deer." "Who was the man, Mr. Fletcher?" "A United States Senator. I'm not going to say the name yet. I need you to hear the rest first, or you won't believe the name when I say it." He described the location, the time, the bullet, the panic in the man's voice over the radio. "I got there in 11 minutes. I remember exactly, because I looked at my watch twice on the way, hoping it was slower than it felt. And the boy? He was already gone. There wasn't anything anyone could have done, Agent. I need you to understand that first. I didn't kill him. I didn't shoot him, but God help me, everything after that first minute was mine." What he did next. Fletcher described in fragments interrupted by pain medication and shallow breathing the 4 hours that followed. The senator's panic. The offer made over a second radio call an hour later. The briefcase left at a prearranged trailhead the following morning. The decision, made alone, in the dark, with a body in his truck bed under a tarp, to bury the boy less than half a mile from a grieving family instead of anywhere else, because he reasoned, correctly as it turned out, that no one would think to look that close. Half a mile, Whitlow repeated at the time, according to his own notes. You buried him half a mile from his mother. I know what I did. I've known every day since. Fletcher named the senator at 7:52 a.m., once the story had been told in full sequence. Whitlow, following protocol, did not react on tape. He simply confirmed the name back twice for the recording. At 8:40 a.m., Fletcher gave the coordinates: the fallen redwood, the hollow cavity beneath its root ball, a landmark he described with a precision that startled Whitlow, like he'd walked it in his head every year since. He asked one final question before the recording ended. Will she know it was me, his mother? Will she know? She'll know everything, Mr. Fletcher. He died at 11:06 p.m. that night, before agents had even finished securing the search warrant for the site. No disclaimer text needed here, mid-chapter continuity marker only. Under the Roots, 1982. To understand what searchers walked past for 44 years, you have to go back to the night before the disappearance, a detail Fletcher's confession made newly relevant. A summer storm crossed the meadow on July 13, 1982. Lightning strikes were common in that stretch of the Sierra. Most did nothing but scorch bark. This one found a weak root system on a sequoia already compromised by decades of shallow soil and drought stress. Just after midnight, the tree came down across a fire access trail, tearing its enormous root plate out of the earth and leaving a cavity roughly the size of a small room beneath it. Rangers logged the fallen tree the next morning as a hazard requiring cleanup, a routine entry, filed hours before anyone knew a child was missing. Fletcher, according to his confession, remembered that entry. It's the reason he chose the site. He carried Bobby's body from the hunting site to the cavity under cover of dusk on July 14th, using an access route far from the growing search perimeter. He placed him inside, covered him with loose soil, decaying needles and displaced root material, then closed the gap with a section of bark and forest debris cut to fit. The final step, the one that would defeat 2 federal search dogs 72 hours later, was chemical. Fletcher had access, through his Park Service role, to synthetic predator scent used legitimately for wildlife deterrence work. He applied it liberally to the root system and surrounding soil, reasoning that any dog alerting to the area would be redirected toward a predator theory rather than a human one. It worked exactly as he intended. Rosa Delgado's dogs alerted at the base of the outcrop nearby, not from tracking Bobby's scent to that spot, investigators would later conclude, but from picking up the powerful synthetic predator marker drifting on wind currents from the actual site 30 yards away. The alert sent the entire search effort in the wrong direction at the exact moment it needed to go right. The following morning, Fletcher walked the search grid himself, past the very tree, and redirected 2 separate volunteer teams toward the creek instead. He looked us dead in the eye and pointed us the wrong way, said Paul Ackers, the young ranger who'd worked beside him that week, in a 2026 interview. I've thought about that morning more than I've thought about almost anything else in my life. Bobby remained beneath that root system for 44 years. The tree itself became a minor trail landmark over the decades. Hikers photographed it, sat on its trunk, let their children climb its exposed roots for pictures, all without any way of knowing what those roots concealed. This has been Archive 26. This chapter reconstructs invented events for a fictional case file. No such tree, jacket, or child existed in the real Yosemite record. We return now to 2026, and to what the forensic team found. What the radar found. The search warrant was approved by a federal magistrate at 6 a.m. on July 10, 2026, less than 7 hours after Fletcher's death. An FBI evidence recovery team, working alongside 2 Park Service archaeologists and a forensic anthropologist, arrived at the coordinates by mid-morning. The fallen redwood was still there, weathered gray, half swallowed by 4 decades of undergrowth. Dr. Elena Marchetti, the forensic anthropologist assigned to the recovery, had worked cold case excavations for 19 years. She later described the moment the ground-penetrating radar returned its first clean anomaly at just under 2 meters. You develop an instinct for false positives. Roots, old fence posts, animal burrows. This wasn't that. The signature was too regular, too consistent with skeletal density. I remember telling my technician, very quietly, to slow the sweep down. The excavation took 11 hours, conducted by hand tool from that point forward, in 6-inch layers, screened and logged at each stage. Standard protocol for a site that might also constitute a homicide scene, 44 years cold. At 4:52 p.m., a trowel exposed a small fragment of weathered yellow canvas. Marchetti called a halt to all activity on site for 8 minutes, standard procedure whenever remains are suspected, while the scene was photographed and documented before another inch of soil was moved. By early evening, the recovery team had documented a small, well-preserved skeletal structure, consistent with a child aged 6 to 9, remnants of a yellow jacket matching the original 1982 missing person description on file, and a corroded copper-jacketed rifle round recovered from within the ribcage, caliber and rifling consistent with the weapon Fletcher had described in his final statement. Every element matched the confession, in sequence, without contradiction. The notification. Carol Miller, 73, was living in Clovis, California, 40 minutes from the hospital where Fletcher had died 3 days earlier. She hadn't known his name until the agent sat down across from her. Agent Whitlow made the notification himself, alongside a bureau victim specialist trained for exactly this kind of call. "I've made a lot of hard calls in this job," Whitlow said later. "I've never made one where the person on the other end had already been waiting 44 years for it." Carol didn't ask who the senator was first. According to both agents present, her first question was simpler. Was he scared? At the end, was my boy scared? Neither agent had an honest answer that could comfort her, and both later said the silence that followed was the hardest part of the entire case. No disclaimer text needed here, mid-chapter continuity marker only. The arrest. The former senator, 86, had left public office in the late 1990s and had spent the decades since largely out of the national spotlight, occasionally appearing at charity functions in the Bay Area. Federal marshals, working alongside the FBI, executed the arrest warrant at his residence outside San Francisco at 7:10 a.m. on July 12, 2026, 2 days after the recovery, once forensic confirmation was complete and the warrant cleared review. A local news crew, tipped by a source inside the county clerk's office, captured the arrest live. The footage, an elderly man in a bathrobe being walked to an unmarked sedan past his own rose garden, ran on national broadcasts within the hour. He was charged with second-degree murder, obstruction of justice, and bribery of a federal official, with additional charges under discussion given the decades-long concealment. His attorneys argued diminished capacity and the passage of time. Prosecutors countered with the forensic match, Fletcher's recorded confession, and financial records subpoenaed from a defunct 1982 bank account showing an unexplained $500,000 withdrawal on July 15th of that year, the day after the shooting. 4 months. The trial was expedited on account of the defendant's age and declining health. Though expedited, still meant 4 months of pre-trial motions, evidentiary hearings and jury selection before a single witness was sworn in. Federal prosecutor Diane Kessler had tried exactly one case this old before, a 1970s civil rights cold case that had taken her nearly a decade to bring to trial. She knew the particular difficulty of a case built on a dead man's confession and forensic evidence recovered from bone. "Juries want a living witness," she said afterward. "We had a dead ranger on tape and a skeleton in an evidence locker. Every piece of that case had to be built to stand on its own, because we couldn't put Fletcher on the stand to be cross-examined. He'd already told the truth and then died. That made it airtight in one sense and fragile in another." The forensic testimony. Dr. Elena Marchetti spent a full day on the stand, walking the jury through the excavation methodically. The radar signature, the 6-inch layer protocol, the moment the yellow canvas fragment surfaced, the ballistic match between the recovered round and rifles. The defendant was documented as owning in 1982 hunting license records. Defense counsel pressed her on 44 years of soil composition, root growth, and potential contamination of the site. "I've excavated remains disturbed by everything from flooding to construction equipment," Marchetti told the court. "This site was undisturbed specifically because it was hidden so well. The concealment that kept this boy from being found for 44 years is the same reason the evidence around him stayed remarkably intact." The bank records. An FBI forensic accountant, Raymond Chu, testified to the defunct 1982 account, opened by the defendant under a since-dissolved family trust, closed in 1984, with a single unexplained cash withdrawal of $500,000 on July 15th, the day after the shooting. There was no corresponding purchase, investment, or disbursement on record that explained where that money went, Chu testified. In 41 years of forensic accounting, an unexplained six-figure cash withdrawal the day after a homicide is not a detail I'd call coincidental. The defense. The defense's central argument rested on two pillars: the defendant's advancing dementia, documented by a retained neurologist as having onset likely within the past 5 to 7 years, and the argument that Fletcher's confession, uncorroborated by any living witness to the shooting itself, could not be treated as definitive proof of the defendant's specific mental state on July 14, 1982. "My client is 86 years old and cannot reliably recall what he ate for breakfast," his lead attorney told the jury in closing. "The prosecution is asking you to convict him based entirely on the final words of a man who spent 44 years building a career on lies and who is conveniently no longer available to answer a single question under oath." Kessler's rebuttal, delivered without notes, ran less than 4 minutes. Thomas Fletcher spent 44 years protecting this defendant. He had every reason, right up until his last breath, to take this secret to his grave instead. He didn't. A man doesn't spend his final hours on earth inventing a lie that implicates himself in bribery and obstruction. He spends them telling the truth he couldn't carry any further. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 6 hours across 2 days. Carol Miller sat in the gallery for every day of testimony, seated beside Nancy Reyes, who had each by then set aside her decades-old notes and simply attended as a family friend rather than a reporter. When the verdict was read, guilty on all counts, Carol did not cry, according to those seated near her. She later said she'd spent everything she had crying over the previous 44 years and had nothing left for the moment she'd actually been waiting for. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole and died in a prison medical facility 5 months into his sentence, of causes unrelated to the case. Paul Ackers, the young ranger who had once trusted Fletcher's calm certainty on the first night of the search, was 68 by the time the verdict came down. He'd spent his entire career in the Park Service, retiring as a district chief himself in 2019, in the same office Fletcher had once run. "I built my whole idea of what a good ranger looks like around that man for years," Ackers said, in the same 2026 interview where he first described pointing search teams the wrong direction on Fletcher's orders. "It took me a long time to understand that being calm under pressure isn't the same as being honest." He was calm because he already knew where the boy was. "I mistook that for leadership for most of my career." He said he thought about Bobby Miller every July 14th, whether or not the case had ever been solved. After 2026, he said the date meant something different, not just grief, but a kind of accounting. "I was in the room, professionally speaking, for the whole cover-up without knowing it. I've had to make peace with that. Some debts don't get paid. You just carry them differently once you understand what they are." The return. Bobby Miller's remains were formally released to his family in late 2026, following completion of forensic analysis and the conclusion of pre-trial evidentiary review. Carol Miller held a small graveside service in Bakersfield, 44 years and 1 season after her son had disappeared. Ray had died in 2009, never learning what had happened to his son. Nancy Reyes, the reporter who'd kept a cardboard box of notes in her garage for 4 decades, attended the service. She didn't introduce herself as press. She simply stood at the edge of the gathering, the way she'd stood at the edge of that meadow in 1982, and watched. Hal Whitfield, the retired detective who'd flagged the file in 2011 and watched it sit untouched for 6 years, read about the arrest in the newspaper, the same way most of the country did. "I wasn't owed anything," he said. "I just wanted to know I'd been right to push. Turns out I was. That doesn't fix the 6 years the file sat in a drawer. Nothing fixes that." Carol Miller, at the small service, held a fragment of yellow fabric recovered from the soil, the only piece of jacket that remained. She didn't speak for the cameras that had followed the case since the arrest. She spoke once, quietly, to the small group of family gathered around the grave. 44 years, I told myself, I just needed to know where he was. I know now that wasn't true. I needed to know someone would finally say his name, and mean it. What she kept. For 4 decades, Carol had kept Bobby's room essentially untouched. Not as a shrine, she was always careful to say, but because she'd never found a reason urgent enough to change it. The bedspread, a faded Yosemite Park map, thumbtacked crooked to the wall. A shoebox of the same kind of rocks and pine cones he'd always been collecting the summer he vanished. After the service, she added one thing to that shoebox. A small evidence bag, released to her by the Bureau along with the remains, containing the fragment of yellow canvas recovered from beneath the redwood roots. She didn't display it. She placed it at the bottom of the box, underneath everything else, the way you might bury something you finally trust the ground to hold. Danny Ostrowski, the boy who'd traded rocks with Bobby the night before he disappeared, 60 years old by the time the case broke, drove down from Modesto for the service, though he'd never met Carol Miller in the intervening 44 years. "I introduced myself and told her who I was," he said afterward. "She held my hand for a long time before she said anything. Then she said, 'You're the last person who got to be his friend. I don't think I'll ever hear anything that hits harder than that for the rest of my life.'" Hal Whitfield did not attend the service. He said later he hadn't felt it was his place. He'd flagged a file, not raised a child, not carried a searchlight through 3 sleepless nights, not spent 4 decades keeping a shoebox of pine cones. But he did, several weeks later, mail Carol Miller a copy of his original 2011 cold case flag request, the one that had sat unanswered in a federal queue for 6 years. She wrote him back a single line, which he kept framed in his study afterward. "Thank you for being the first person who thought my son's file deserved a second look. I only wish the system had agreed with you sooner." The Meadow once more. In the fall of 2026, Carol returned to Tuolumne Meadows one final time, not for an anniversary, not for a search, but simply to sit by the whale rock, the way she had in 1992, 34 years earlier, when a young ranger hadn't known what to tell her. The fallen redwood was gone by then, cleared as part of the active crime scene investigation earlier that year, its root system fully excavated and documented. Where it had lain for over 4 decades, there was only disturbed earth, already beginning to soften back into the forest floor. Carol didn't need the tree still standing to know exactly where to sit. Nancy Reyes, who drove up with her that day at Carol's own invitation, said the older woman didn't speak for nearly an hour. Then she said one thing quietly, mostly to herself. "He's not under there anymore. That's the part I keep forgetting. He's not under there anymore." This has been Archive 26, a fictional case reconstruction inspired by the real toll unsolved disappearances take on American families. Every name, department, and individual in this story was invented for the purposes of this narrative and does not depict a real person or real event. If you or someone you know is affected by an unresolved missing persons case, real support and resources exist through the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System. Thank you for watching Archive 26.